Now, boys and girls, Mrs. Henry said, when each person had picked a name. Are you ready? You can unfold your paper and read it, but don't let anyone see it. Katie quickly went to work on hers. It was all crumpled up, and she had to smooth it out flat on her knee. She read it. Obie Potts, it said. Katie looked up at Mrs. Henry and smiled. Obie. She had gotten her very own brother. I got a good one, she said out loud. She had forgotten to raise her hand, but Mrs. Henry didn't get mad. She just smiled and put a finger on her lips. Emil was chewing on his lip, the way he did when he was thinking. He remembered to raise his hand. When Mrs. Henry called on him, he said, presents cost a lot. He sounded worried. Katie thought she knew why. Emil had no mother or father. He lived with his grandma. Katie thought maybe they didn't have too much money. But that's the second part of the Secret Santa, Mrs. Henry said, smiling. You can't spend any money on the presents. No money, Arthur said. That's silly. No money, Mrs. Henry said. You can make something like a small drawing, perhaps. If your mom is baking cookies, you can bring in a cookie. Or a lollipop, Obie said. Katie smiled. She knew how Obie loved lollipops. Mrs. Henry smiled, too. Yes, she said. A lollipop would be fine. Or maybe you can bring a used book of your own or a toy, if it's in good condition and if your mom or dad says it's all right. But how come no money? Arthur said. I like buying presents. Once I bought my dad some pencil. Katie started to giggle. Pencil was a silly present. She looked over at Amelia. Amelia was giggling, too. Mrs. Henry didn't laugh, though. She just went on. Well, she said. Sometimes there's too much attention paid to what we spend at Christmas and at Hanukkah. We can give something that doesn't cost anything. Not anything but love. And that's part of the magic of the season, bringing love and joy to others. Katie looked down at her paper again. She smiled. She loved Obie. She couldn't wait to give him a surprise. But then she wondered how. She raised her hand. Mrs. Henry, she said. If it's a secret, how do we get it to the person? Mrs. Henry smiled. You'll just put the present on my desk with the person's name on it in the morning. And at the end of the day, I'll give out the presents. Nobody will know who they're from. Katie thought. She had a zillion ideas for Obie. Lollipops. Cookies. A drawing. Maybe she could make a drawing of an airplane, his favorite thing. She could do it on the computer. But then she had a worry. He knew practically everything about her, all the toys she owned, the computer, everything. If Mom baked cookies and Katie gave one to Obie, he would know who his Secret Santa was. Katie frowned. Well, she'd figure it out. She wondered whose Secret Santa Obie was. She looked all around her. She looked at Ricardo. She hoped Ricardo was her Secret Santa. Ricardo was new in class, and Katie thought maybe she'd like to marry him someday. Then, Mrs. Henry said, on Friday, the last day, we get to tell to whom we've been Secret Santa. Katie leaned close to Amelia. I hope Ricardo has me, she whispered. Amelia nodded. He's nice, she said. But she was frowning. What's the matter? Katie said. Amelia was feeling around her hair. I lost one of my barrette, she said. My favorites. There were two. Katie looked. Amelia was right. There was only one barrette. It was red with diamonds and flowers on it. I'll help you look for it later, Katie said. Who'd you get? Amelia made a mad face. I'm not telling, she said. She put a hand over her paper and slid it inside her notebook. Katie made a mad face back at her. That meanie Amelia. And she was supposed to be her best friend. Girls, Mrs. Henry said. Katie looked up. Mrs. Henry was making a mad face, too. Katie turned back to her desk. She folded her arms. So do you all think you understand the rules? Mrs. Henry said. Each day next week, you bring in a present. And on Friday, we get to tell who we've been Secret Santa to. Tiffany had her hand up. She was sitting up straight and tall. She waited until Mrs. Henry called on her. Yes, Tiffany, Mrs. Henry said. What if you don't like the person you got? She said. Mrs. Henry smiled. It's a season of magic, she said. Remember, maybe some of the magic will be that you'll begin to like that person. Tiffany shook her head hard. Her long ponytail flew from side to side. She said. I hate her. Oh, it's a her, Bobby Bork called out. We know you got a girl, we know you got a girl. That's enough, Bobby, Mrs. Henry. She turned back to Tiffany. Said. I don't think you should use the word hate, Tiffany, she said. You think about it. Tiffany took a big breath. She breathed it out of her nose so it sounded like a whistle. I won't say it, Tiffany said. She said it very quietly. But I feel it. Tiffany looked across to where Katie was sitting. The only person next to Katie was Irma Wagner. Hardly anybody in class liked Irma. Irma was a big tattletale. But Katie was pretty sure Tiffany wasn't looking at Irma. Tiffany was looking straight at her.